Good morning. Hopefully everyone has had a chance to go through this collection. Represented on the tables in front of you is the smallest fraction of the Tony Walton collection here at the library. 8 pallets of collection materials going over about 50 productions. We just pulled a little bit of The Wiz, just a little bit of The Wiz, and the smallest little bit of other shows. We are very grateful to have with us the production designer for The Wiz, Academy Award, Tony Award, and Drama Desk Award winner, Mr. Tony Walton. He's right over there. I wonder if anyone wants to start us off with a question about The Wiz or about what you see on the tables.
Thank you. Good morning. I'm Brenda Seiler with the Washington Informer newspaper. I'd like to talk about the process of coming up with the design. Who are you meeting with first? The director, the executive producer, the actors? What is the role?
It was the director, Sidney Lumet, who is somebody I had already worked with a number of times. I think we did about 7 productions together, 1 theatrical and the other 6 all movies. This was about the 4th or 1st one that we worked on together. Excuse me. And, sorry.
You worked with Michael before, too.
Oh, yes, as my wife. This is my wife, Genevieve. She just pointed out I should mention that I had been lucky enough to work with tiny Michael Jackson many years earlier when he was still the original, so to say, Michael Jackson. And that was on a television special called Free to Be You and Me. And he and Roberta Flack were in a sort of graphic-looking attic and pulling clothing items like boas and big hats and so on out of a costume basket. It was a black and white sequence with only the costume items being in bright color. And they sang to each other, I like what you look like. And the final line is Roberta Flack singing to Michael Jackson, I love what you look like. Please don't change. I don't think he quite got that message, sadly. But he wasn't chanting. Anyway, my first contact came from Sydney, and he said, I've been invited by Motown and Universal to direct the movie of the musical The Wiz. I was sort of excited to hear it, as I'd seen the show on Broadway and enjoyed it a great deal. He said, it turns out that Diana Ross had a dream in which she was Dorothy in the original Wizard of Oz, and so she would very much like to star in the movie. He said, which of course has made it fundable, which it probably would not otherwise be, a much too ambitious a thing to do for the usually rather restricted black audience that made up movie audiences. So I said, is Diana Ross going to be Dorothy? And he said, yes. I said, but how do we get into the fantasy if we can't go through a child? I said, well, we'll make her a teacher of school children so she'll have access to young kids. And I said, I do apologize for being so frank about this, Sydney, but I think in your list of truly terrific ideas, this one comes somewhere way down the bottom. So then he said, well, I have a secret reason too, and that is that my daughters, Amy and Jenny, who were at that time 5, very small, could get sung to by the Good Witch, which I would love to be played by my daughter's grandmum, Lena Horne, the great jazz and blues singer. And she'll be able to sing to my tiny girls, believe in yourself, believe in yourself. And I said, oh, that's a real reason. I think I'm suckering into it. And then he said, there's another thing as you know, because we've done some of them together, almost always filmed in Manhattan, in the hurly-burly of Manhattan. And I would love, because most of these things have either been kind of political or cops and robbers, I would love to do a Valentine to the city in which we sort of celebrate its extremely peculiar nature. And I said, so does that mean once we get going with the Scarecrow, the Tin Man, the Lion, and Dorothy, and Toto, does it mean we're going to see them in realistic, real New York streets? And he said, yes. And I said, but you can't put a man in a furry suit in the middle of a New York street and have people believe that this is really a lion. He said, well, maybe we need to do a little something to change every location so that it is in some way fantasized. So that was the sort of point of departure for the look of the film. Anybody else?
You mentioned that you did see the stage play. Did you have any inspiration from what was done on stage for film?
No, because, as I mentioned, Sydney wanted to urbanize the piece into the whole story, so that instead of being, out in the country and sort of pleasantly bucolic, he wanted to have all the rattle and snap and nonsense of city life. So there was nothing about the look of the original stage production that we tapped into at all. The only thing was that it was clearly going to be a huge undertaking, and somehow Universal, in tapping through all the ancient contracts about their semi-ownership of the rights to the movie, discovered that they were only in a position to fund it if it was delivered within a total of what turned out to be about 15 weeks, which gave us 12 weeks of shooting and 3 weeks to try and plan it out. So that was such a challenge. I said to Sydney, although I've usually also done the costumes for the movies we've worked on together, I think I probably should stick to just one discipline on this one and do the production design. And so he said, well, I'll have Jeffrey Holder, who was the brilliant actor, director, choreographer, voiceover chap, who had done the designs for the stage production. I'll have him take a crack at it. And for whatever reason, that didn't work out. Maybe it was hard for Jeffrey to get too far away from his original take on it. So Sydney came back in and said, sorry, Tony, you're stuck with doing it. So I said, well, could I take the two biggest chunks of costumes and see if I can get the help of other folk? For example, in the Emerald City, maybe we could approach the New York 7th Avenue fashion designers and ask if they would make their current line or their upcoming line in our colors and our fabrics. And he said, well, good luck. But I went to, I think it was 7 of them, and said, you will, of course, get a gigantic credit at the end of the movie's credits. And we hope that that might replace what should, of course, be a proper payment to you for all this. So, in fact, we got those roughly 4,000 costumes for free. And if I had done them, I cannot imagine how much they must have cost, but it would have originally put a stop to the movie. And the costumes for the poppy sequence, where the, so to say, hookers are inviting our heroes into their poppy land, which of course is drug-infused. I went to the screenwriter, Joel Schumacher, because I knew that in an earlier career he had been a fashion designer in New York. And I asked him if he might have fun doing all these puppy girls, because again, it was a large number. And he said, I would love that. You know, and here I am doing a screenplay for an absolutely complex and bizarre, fantastical movie. And I have no education in that, how to do that. But I do know how to make a few frocks. So those are Joel's designs.
I was so glad you spoke so frankly, frankly and honestly about your reservations and your questions going in. What finally convinced you? I can clearly see why Mr. Lumet was convinced. What finally convinced you to take this on?
Well, as I mentioned, he was already, because we had worked together so much, and I had costumed his wife in her solitary stage appearance, with Lena Horne's eye over my shoulder, watching very carefully her daughter getting costumed. But we had become close, and we were very fond of Sydney and the whole family. So it needed a fair amount for me to be able to say anything negative or to pull back from it. And once he gave this rather emotional reason for wanting to do it, I was on board with that. And then he mentioned this fantasizing of Manhattan, and that sounded to me impossible. And that's the kind of challenge I like. So, so I had to go. Yes, of course, and not unlike today, it was an extremely political time, particularly for the black community and, of course, black entertainers. I'd been lucky enough to be the designer for Duke Ellington's Broadway Sophisticated Ladies and done the poster for that, and also worked with Sammy Davis and a black company on Golden Boy, the musical, on Broadway. So I was feeling an affinity, which was lucky because I was pretty much the only white non-American on the set at most times. But I loved that aspect of it, and that I would be able to get more embroiled with the black performers and the black community. And many, many of our crew were black. Not that there was that big a pool to pull from in those days, but I had my assistant art director, was actually at that time the only black designer working in movies in New York. But I was very happy to be able to get him. So there were lots of reasons to have affection about doing this project. Probably, maybe the most appealing one being that it struck me as being completely nuts to try and make this movie the way that Sydney wanted to do it. So that kind of challenge, luckily, is always very appealing to me, because I love to try to look as if I'm, in terms of my visual sensibility, a different person with almost every project I undertake. You know, so I might go right from, say, Chekhov to something like this, and that's a real help if the difference in the nature of the material is enough to draw different versions of yourself out of you. I really love that. So I had for a while a little company, and it was called TW Varieties, not only because of variety being the spice of life, but because of my hope to be a variously different person with every project. And that's been my challenge, and mostly I've been lucky to have the opportunity to choose what's next and make sure it's as different as possible as what came before. I'm not sure if I'm answering you. Good.
Hi, my name is Katrina, and I wanted to share just a brief story. I went to a performing arts junior high school, and we did modern dance and ballet, et cetera. And
In Washington?
In outside of Washington D.C. in Maryland. And my 7th grade year, we did a production of The Wiz. And interestingly enough, I had not seen The Wiz before, and I've seen it several times after that. But I had the honor of playing the witch. So I wanted to just hear from you.
The Wicked Witch?
The Wicked Witch, yes. Let me differentiate. The Wicked Witch. So I wanted to just hear from you a little bit about the costume design of the Wicked Witch.
Well, Mabel King, the actress who plays the witch in the movie and had also played it on Broadway, was such an explosive and over-the-top personality and in her performance as the Wicked Witch, as you'll see if you haven't already in the movie. So I thought I've got to somehow meet this explosion of energy and richness with her costume. Plus the fact that we knew, to tell the end of the story first, that when the Wicked Witch was dead, the Winkies were going to be relieved from their slavery to her, for which they were going to need a lot of oppressive costuming so that they could take off all these oppressive outer garments and come down to as minimal thing as they could, showing skin, for them to go into the freedom dance of Brand New Day. So they were going to be these lumpy things like that. And I thought, as their, so to say, queen, she should have a similar sort of overblown look. I think I gave her 3 crowns. And then, to give her a little more, so to say, richness than her slavies, the Winkies, I thought there should be somewhat bejeweled aspect to her gown. And then I realized, similarly to the Emerald City problem, that if I were to use actual semi-precious stones, again, it would be a costume way beyond what our budget could really manage. So I thought, what about if we just bought hundreds of little rubber dog toys and chopped them up? So that's what we did, and painted some of them with bejeweled flash coloring, reflective coloring. Mabel King was, along with Ted Ross, who had also been in the stage production, who played the Cowardly Lion, they were quite politically active, and there was a wonderful frisson during the filming between them and, say, Nipsey, Russell the Tin Man, because if I had provided something to give a little sort of background to the lives of black entertainers, such as in the carnival sequence where the Tin Man is discovered, there's a kind of wall of posters that feature a lot of minstrel performances and things like that. And Nipsey says, we can't do that. That's just simply not any longer something that we can accept about our lives. Ted Ross and our beloved Wicked Witch said, are you nuts, Nipsey? That's our history. We wouldn't be here doing what we're doing now if we hadn't had to go through that. And so they and their team, as it were wonderfully supportive if I was pushing the line a little bit. There are occasions when I'm a little disconcerted seeing now what I did then, and the chief one being the flying monkeys, partly because Sydney said, you know, if we, as you suggest, if we put them on motorbikes with sort of wings made of their plumbing, I think that has a danger of being kind of appealing or charming, but they have to be scary. So he said, you've got to go somewhere with their faces to make them truly scary. And think of it as being completely taste-free. So that was the reason we went the way we did. And there's, nasty, big, blubbery lips and things like that. So it's a caricature. My wife said that, of course, happened because of the great speed with which they flew.
I'm curious.
I'm so sorry.
No, that's fascinating, please. I'm just curious, you sort of started to touch on this in the answer you just gave, but what kind of research or inspiration did you do around African American history? So much of the movie is evocative and really intentional around that. So I'm curious what your process was in designing all of this.
Well, it was, because of the things that I had worked on earlier, including the dreaded 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, the Lerner and Bernstein bicentennial bomb, which is about how badly the blacks have always been treated throughout all presidencies. So I'd already been completely consumed by research, though in that particular instance it was fascinating because Bernstein and Lerner said, we think we're going to make it more interesting for the audiences to follow by, instead of it being a sort of realistic portrayal of the story, we're going to have it be a production in rehearsal, sort of halfway to being ready to put on dress text. So the whole design approach was that. And I was in Philadelphia starting to get the sets installed when they had what in the theater is known as the gypsy run-through, which just before you leave town for the out-of-town workouts, there's a performance for the profession and family members. And it's always on a Monday night when no shows are performing. And it's always thought to be the most successful version that anybody ever sees, because the audience, who are mostly professionals, have to bring their own imaginations to flesh out what are the scenes and what are the costumes and so forth, because in the rehearsal state, none of it was fully as it would be in the finished production. And I said, how did it go? And he said, well, it was calamitous. Nobody picked up on the idea that it was a nation in rehearsal to become a united nation. And we somehow, the channel through which we had chosen to lead them, it was very murky. So I'm heading back to my hotel room now, and I'm going to rewrite the script with everything that we deal with. If it's the Oval Office, we have to see the actual Oval Office on stage. And I said, this is Alan Lerner saying this, I said, Alan, we're loading the scenery in now, and that's going to be a lot of work and a lot of money. And he said, well, that's the other problem. He said, the musical is being funded by my old roommate from Harvard, who is now the head of Coca-Cola. So the entire investment was put up by Coca-Cola, and Alan's roommate, who was at the Gypsy Run-Through, was appalled at the bones of the story and the fact that presidents were being treated so cavalierly, impolitely. So that became very tricky. I won't tell you the whole saga, but I had done this humongous amount of research, and of course it was all the designs were on paper or in model form or whatever, and they are actually here, the designs for that production in the Library of Congress. Everything that I had studied towards coming up with the look of that production was in a flash, in one phone call, dead and gone, and had been, as it were, unneeded. So I still had it, luckily. I mean, sometimes when you go through the whole production process, all the research materials you gather sort of have a way of dissipating en route to the final objects delivered. But because there was this abrupt change of scheme, I had put all of my research materials away in my studio. So I still had them all. This is a very long, roundabout way of saying it was in my visual alphabet, as it were, through that and through the research I'd done for Golden Boy, which is essentially a New York story. And I'd gone up, this is 64, I think, 1964. It was, anyway, a very politically tough time. And I had went up and wandered around Harlem, taking Polaroid photographs and spilling this stuff into the streets. And when I got back, we had a meeting at which Sammy Davis was present. He was to be the star. And I said that, I looked at this and this and this, and I'm thinking this might be the scenic environment for so long, 127th Street. And Sammy said, "Where did you get these photos?" And I said, "I've been wandering around Harlem and just responding to anything that catches my attention." He said, "You are completely out of your mind. Don't you dare go there together alone without me." And I said, "I'm the honorary mayor of Harlem, and if you're with me, you're safe. Otherwise, you're just a white idiot and in a great deal of danger." So anyway, it was a world I was luckily and enjoyably starting to explore, and I was thrilled to get deeper into it for this, although it's all, as you see, a very strange and mixed bag of different takes. Some of it, of course, came with the territory. The scarecrow is made of garbage bags, and the garbage mostly consists of shredded paper. Each piece of shredded paper contained a quote, many times a famous quote by an ancient Greek or Sir Winston Churchill or whoever. And that led to the nature of the costume that Solomon was showing you. And he had a couple of food-related items on him, the popcorn bucket for his hat, and a chocolate cup for his nose, for which Michael was bizarrely grateful. We didn't know, and actually at that time the world didn't know, that because Michael was so pretty, his dad used to taunt him by saying, "You've got a big nose, you're ugly, ugly, ugly," and his brothers picked up on that, and his brothers started calling him Big Nose. And that was one of the deepest, difficult memories that Michael carried with him. So the fact that I'd covered his nose with a chocolate wrapper gave him a lot of pleasure. And the fact that the other food available to him was popcorn also gave him a lot of pleasure, because another not incredibly well-known fact about he and his brothers was that they, generally speaking, ate with their hands and when at home, and probably elsewhere too. And Michael had said at some point that he hoped he wasn't going to have to be made to eat in this movie, because he didn't really know which weapon to use for the fork and spoon and knife and so on. So I said, well, your hat is popcorn, so you're able to take advantage of that at any times, because all it'll do is soil your gloves a little bit, make them oily. I guess that's probably the tail end of what the question started about.
I want to go back to the Winky costumes and also the flying monkey costumes. Those costumes in particular are just the actors' faces are completely covered and transformed. Apart from anything else, I thought that the actors must be very hot in them. How did you cope with make them sort of, when you were conceiving the design, livable for the actors when they were in them?
Well, each costume has anywhere from 40 to 80 zippers within it in various places, most concealed, sometimes sort of quite visible, down the jawline, so that when the Wicked Witch is flushed away, there could be a sort of interesting look to the fact that they're discarding their entrapment, as it were. And as I said, we also wanted what they were oppressively held in by to be several layers, so that the process of becoming free of this oppression would be, a piece by piece discarding, disrobing, that would give Quincy Jones, our chief musician, an opportunity for a strange and interesting intro to this huge orchestral dance piece that was just about to take place, which is, of course, the moment when they all become free, and the song is about that.
The flying monkeys are they attached to the wheel? The flying monkeys, how do
Yeah, the legs on that design are actually dummy legs attached right to the wheel guard. And the disc that says flying monkeys is actually hiding the real knee of the real leg, which is, so they have their legs pushed up behind them. So we never saw their actual legs, and it made life quite difficult for them when coming to a halt.
I'd like to hear about the tools of the trade. What do you use? What pencils, chalk, paint, brushes? Are you able to tell us
all
about
the above,
and
anything that
special
can make
kinds?
a mark of any sort. And the bigger the range, the more fun it is, and you can keep getting yourself surprised and available and open to little accidents and spills and what have you. So I do use everything, including, particularly in this production, a lot of collage. And the books that Solomon has been passing around are actually sort of a page-by-page breakdown of what we hoped we were going to do with the movie, which starts out, as you'll see on most pages, with a sort of Hockney-esque photo collage of the location, whatever it is. Hockney-esque meaning several photos pasted over each other. And then I would lay a sheet of acetate over that and either put a piece of, so to say, yellow brick road onto that, but so that you can still see through. I wonder, can you show maybe one of the yellow brick ease on down things? Well, the only reason, that would be a good one, the one you have at the end of it, maybe that. So you can, this is one of my favorite little moments in the movie. It was that entrance to the subway, Michelle, where it says, "Get down." So that started out as a photograph of a subway entrance in Manhattan. And then I've gradually dressed up the photograph with the sort of horror poster and the entrance sign which says "Get Down," and then maybe go a couple forward from that. Yes, the poster, which will you I think see many. Oh, they're all at the end of this table. Was originally painted or suggested by Sidney Lumet's elder daughter, who was about 7. And we were so thrilled with it and asked her if we could use it in the movie. And that made her very shy. So she only struggled her way through a second one before giving up. So my own daughter did the other two, sort of based on Amy's style. At any rate, as Solomon is sort of showing, this was the process of trying to find physical means of shifting the reality of the urban location into something that now would have a sort of fantasy take to it. What have you got there? Did a piece just drop off it? Okay, so which one is that? Oh, right. And do we have the big one of that or not? No. Okay, so that's the Flushing Meadows Wells Fair, which has become, by the time we worked there, a skating rink. So each layer suggests how we're going to treat this location, and then what kind of objects are going to be in there. And this sequence takes place in Graffiti City, and Miss One is the good witch of Graffiti City, and that's why those slides and so forth are in numerical form. I think you can see only 4 there. There's a 1 just to the left of the big 2 in the middle. And that's a 0, right? That's a 0, yes. 0, 1, 2. There's a, and there's a 3. But I think the 4th is the last one shown there. And they were all practical slides that the Munchkins could, the Graffiti City kids could skid down. So, because the good witch of Graffiti City is Miss One, and she runs the numbers game, all her numbers game runners, who are the Graffiti City kids, had costumes that were an enlarged number. And they all escaped from imprisonment in, oh, that's Miss One. And she's somewhere. Oh. So you can see there, each of them is dressed in a kind of big sloppy version of a number. And they are originally flattened and imprisoned on the graffiti-covered walls of Graffiti City. And they find their freedom when Dorothy, through her accidental arrival in Graffiti City, happens to squash the twin of the Wicked Witch. So once they're released, because you're now seeing them in all directions, the flat and easily recognizable version of the number has kind of gone, and they're just a big series of amorphous blobs. And like the Winkies in Evelyn's Sweatshop, have too much to bear, are wearing uncomfortable, bulky things in most cases, despite which they have to do some very lively dancing, as to the Winkies in Brand New Day. So we had to have a lot of fans available to cool folks down, even though this sequence was shot out of doors in the middle of the night. We still had to bring some bring some big fans so that they could huddle around it for a moment before going on. Not so much to get rid of their own sweat and heat, but to get rid of any blodges that were starting to appear on the costumes from the moisture.
Speaking of oversized, I have a question about the camera and the microphone in Emerald City, and because it's bonkers, and how you came up with that, and how you made those pieces, and I'll show those around.
Well, this was great fun to do, less fun to be inside of and perform, especially since it was a long night. But and Solomon will show you what the actor-performer inside the microphone is actually doing, the position that he needs to take.
So for the microphone, the actor has to stand like that, and walk around like that. And for the camera, there's an actor, and one hand operates the lens. And me.
This was partly because within the World Trade Center, which had only recently been launched, so it was a very important new element in Manhattan, which is one of the reasons why our director, Sidney Lumet, said he would like to find some way to use the Twin Towers and the World Trade Center. It, by a piece of luck, has a sort of circular moat between the buildings, which is filled with water, but we just thought we could empty the water out and place huge sheets of milk frosted plexiglass into the circle and have lights of different colors beneath, so that each time the whiz changes his mind about what is the color of the week, the lights in every part of the plaza, the, so to say, pyramids with jewels on top of them, and the ring of water, what was water itself, could all be changed by colored lights. But, of course, that meant that every performer in the sequence had to change from originally green into red when the whiz, Richard Pryor, decides that red should be the color of the moment. And then he ultimately settles on gold, which is, of course, red, yellow, and green. And so we gave him a big traffic light atop the Twin Towers for his speakers to sprout out from. And the dancers had to follow the signal from whichever light the traffic light was lit. That was a... Oh, my wife was reminding me of a terrifying thing. At the time, the towers were just completed and the dark buildings surrounding them. And because of the towers making the dark buildings surrounding them look small, they also looked a bit like the speakers that are on the forestage of a rock and roll troupe. And so we turned them into that and put gigantic knobs on them and amplifiers and various different dials and pigs and whistles. And that was the reason that Sidney said, well, if we're going to have that to be the source of where the music's coming from, we should probably make it be as if it were a TV shoot and have a TV camera wandering around, a microphone and so on. So that was that, why that notion happened.
Mr. Walton, what happens behind the scenes, or maybe what happened to you personally when the movie was not a success, at least critically.
Yes.
I assume over time it's made a lot of money, but
Yes.
critically, what did you learn from that?
Well, we didn't learn that it wasn't a success until after the premiere, the opening performance, of course. And the premiere performance, particularly in New York, was wild. The audience was, a large part black audience. And they and the rest of the audience went crazy at the end of it, and standing and applauding and yelling and shouting for quite a long time. I mentioned this to the great Mike Nichols, who I used to collaborate a lot with too. I said, we had this astonishing response. And he said, well, you're home free. He said, there's no denying that. It doesn't matter what reviews you get. It's clearly a winner and something people want to enjoy. And then the reviews came out and they were very iffy. And so the excitement with which we had been making it, particularly the, so to say, politically related reasons, which had been our little engines somehow as we were trying to make it. The disappointment with the faintness of the reviews sort of made us forget that whole drive and experience until fairly recently, when it's become picked up, so to say. And there was a most wonderful piece of journalism in the Los Angeles Times 3 days ago, on my birthday, I think. Written for the Times by a man who, at the time of The Wiz, was the same age as Diana Ross, which was supposedly 26. Did you find that? Sorry. Did you find the Los Angeles Times piece?
Oh, I didn't print that.
Oh, you didn't? Oh, okay. Well, it's almost worth Googling because it's a view of the movie that covers much more than any previous news item has and is clearer and less gibbery than me. So if you're actually interested in learning more about the movie, that's a great resource.
Thank you so much for sharing.
Thank you.
Just as somebody in an audience, I'm always so listening to you, I'm amazed at how much goes into trying to get the audience to feel what you're trying to portray in this movie, or any movie. When do you realize that they get what you've been trying to show them with all of your work? Thank you.
I think it's the sort of bedrock beginning of anybody who wants to be an entertainer or tell stories or grab everybody's attention, have it center on them. It's, I think, just part of what you carry with you as you're starting to think, how best do we tell this story? And are there ways in which we can make it suddenly more exciting or suddenly more soothing? And those sort of natural instincts which rise up within you because, of course, you are yourself an audience, lead me into the sort of initial jump-off points for each sequence. And I made, I think maybe this is in the book, Solomon, a huge sheet of foam core with a scene-by-scene breakdown of the palette for the movie. This is something I always try to do, which is not normal, but turns out to be very helpful to a lot of people. It's literally a little tiny scene-by-scene suggestion of what the palette, the color palette of the sequence is going to be. And sometimes some little artifacts or rusted beams or something just scribbled in to give a little bit more information. And in a wonderful interview with our cinematographer, Ozzie Morris. He is asked how he made his lighting selections throughout the movie, and he drew attention to that particular color breakdown and said that it was, he went from that in every instance in his choice of colors and the way he was planning to light the scene. So that was it was very flattering of him to say that, and I was thrilled to discover that this rather laborious thing that I would do at the beginning of every movie had turned out to be so useful.
So we have time for just one more question, and if folks don't have one, I do. Can you talk about basically the final scene of the movie, Glinda and her snow babies? Why babies suspended in the air? Why snow, since she's the good witch of the South? And how did you dress Lena Horne?
Well, all very interesting questions. As I mentioned, the idea of having his daughter's grandmom sing to them and will them to live their lives to the fullest, that was why there were a spilling of babies surrounding her. This was my attempt to imagine Sydney's youngest daughter floating in the sky, receiving the wisdom of the good witch. And the snow was because that's how we originally meet Glinda and her snow babies. In the storm and the typhoon at the beginning, it is snowing in Manhattan, and that whole sequence until Dorothy flies through the snowstorm into the Oz sign at the top of the graffiti city is all snow infested, and I guess that was the reason for that. Lena's costume, can you imagine getting to costume someone like Lena Horne? So, and of course Diana Ross. But it was interesting for Diana because she was used to being costumed spectacularly. And it was clear that she had to be not necessarily a dowdy little gal, but a simple looking young lady. With Lena, not only is she the good witch and queen, so to say, but she's a night figure, in addition to the snow or the stars. And so I made layers and layers of slightly differently tinted chiffon and other live and fragile substances. And throughout them, there's just a few of these on the babies too, but on Glinda, there's a sort of forest of grain of wheat, tiny baby little lights, which we stained the colors of her costume in sort of blues and purples and violets and mauves, and so that she could be invisible. And then when the stars and the snow and everything began to appear, these little flashes of light would start to make her visible. And this is one of the strange things that you don't expect to happen in the middle of filming. There she is, the invaluable Lena Horne, on fly wires up in the air, starting to sing Believe in Yourself. And she's wearing on her girdle the battery that powers these little grain of wheat lights. And before too long, the battery starts to heat up and misfunctions. And she continues and completes the entire song, The Show Must Go On, despite the fact that she got quite a serious burn on her butt. And such a gasp of relief she gave when she completed the number. There are often, actually in the original Wizard of Oz, the Wicked Witch, the Wicked one, had terrible problems with the makeup, the green makeup, and had to delay shooting because of the state that her skin was becoming. Equally, the Tin Man had the same thing with the various silvers and aluminums they painted him with. He had a horrible reaction. I think they even had a different Tin Man, is that correct? Oh, that's right. And he had such a violent reaction to the silver makeup that he had to give up the role. So these are the things that you don't sort of cross your mind until they hit you in the face. And I was abject at having caused Lena Horne a moment of discomfort. So it was a nice thing for us to tease each other about over the following years. She just coincidentally happened to move into the building in New York in which we live. Actually, she donated a beautiful, very long green settee to us when she left. Odd that it was a green.
Well, butt burns are always a good way to close out an event. When you watch the movie now, when she says, "Ooh, yeah," you'll have a clear indication of what's going on.
That's where the song is headed.
It's exactly where it is. Thank you all very much. Thank you, Tony.
Such a pleasure.
Insights.
Thank you. Thank you all.